When I was 15, I was scouted to be a model. Happened in a pretty stereotypical way. I was at the mall with my mom and my first agent came running up to us asking if I'd ever considered modeling. I had. But the thing is, when I was 16, I also started coming out as trans. So for the first 3 years of my modeling career, I was technically working as a male model. And I was doing really well for myself. My first ever gig was an editorial for Rich and Nisi that got printed in Elle magazine. Ironic because now my name is Elle. See, at the time, I didn't really know that this was going to be the foundational steps of something much bigger later in my life. At around 18 years old, I finally started socially transitioning and openly coming out as trans to most of the people in my immediate circle and outside of that. The thing is, my dad had also just died earlier that year, and so any desire I had to dive into something more permanent, i.e. university, kind of went to the wayside because I was kind of reminded of the importance of life and how short and brief it can be at times. So my plight was to fully invest my time and energy into being myself. And that's what I ended up doing. But I also wanted to keep working, which meant I didn't want to stop modeling. And so luckily I had good enough relationships in the industry to keep doing that. The thing is, I didn't really understand how important what I was doing was because it was the first time something like this had ever happened in South Africa. See, I then started modeling as an openly trans woman. And if you know anything about South Africa, we're super progressive on paper. In fact, I think we have one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, if not the most progressive constitution in the world. But emphasis on paper. See, socially, some of the progressive nature of our country's politics don't really play out day to day. And so historically, most of the representations of trans people in media had been pretty negative, if not extremely stereotypical. And so for one of the first times ever in South Africa, there was finally neutral to positive representation of trans people. The thing is, I didn't really understand the weight of that at the time. I was 18 years old, so it never really crossed my mind about the importance of showing up in that way in the spaces I did. During my career, I actually got to do a lot of fun stuff. I got to be a part of some important documentaries and TV specials, and so I'm going to talk about some of my favorite things I ever got to do. I got to be in a documentary pretty soon after I came out by ID about queer youth in Johannesburg.
Finally now, I think that people are starting to understand that there just isn't one trans narrative.
And that's such an important thing for me because not all of us have this wake up and change thing. It's a process. My dad passed in January. It kind of shifted things into perspective for me. Life is so short and you don't have any time promised. So living your life to please other people probably isn't the healthiest thing to do. It's a big reason that I kind of just started the process of transitioning and being open about that. Because for me it was what happens when I'm my dad's age and I start wanting to change things but it's already too late? Then is that an authentic life lived? Is that a life of happiness? I wouldn't think so.
I also got to be one of the voices in MTV Africa's documentary, The People vs. the Patriarchy.
We all dance to music about men drugging women at parties and having their way. And we're oh yeah, this song is so think about the artists that come and headline here. Yeah. They're the same artists that consistently perpetuate the same things. And we dance to it in the clubs and we buy their music and we support it. And it's we almost turn an ignorant eye to what's being said. That affects all of us. And it's when we start tackling what we consume and who we praise, that's when we can start seeing changes. Because why are we listening to artists that literally sing about raping us? It's great to aspire to be successful and wealthy and powerful in your spaces, but that shouldn't be hand in hand with also taking dominance and power over the woman that you're singing to. We don't critique it enough.
I was the first trans person to ever be featured in a national banking ad. Mine was for Nedbank. I also got to do some pretty amazing stuff with local brands like Edgar's, Woolworths, I was also one of the first trans women to be featured in a beauty editorial by one of the major fashion institutions. This is actually me in an issue of Cosmopolitan. Now, this is a pretty big deal because if you know anything about Cosmopolitan, it's kind of been an institution for the ideal of feminine presentation and beauty. So having a trans woman framed in that way in the beauty section of the magazine was pretty monumental. I also got to do a lot of other fun stuff that is too much to name. But one of my biggest jobs was actually when I became one of the faces and ambassadors for Dove. Dove had a campaign called #ShowUs, which was also a partnership between Getty Images and Girl Gaze, and it was all about my mission statement, breaking down barriers in media and actively and positively representing people in spaces that they were traditionally not allowed in.
I think it's like really important that there's at least one kid who can like see themselves in me. People have this idea that you have to be brave to be who you are.
It was such a big deal, but I also was not ready for the weight of what this job would be. Aside from it being a global campaign with obviously a TVC, that's television commercial, I also had my face on billboards, including 2 in Times Square, which is crazy to say, but it completely made me rethink everything I had been doing up to that point. I knew it was really important for me to represent my community as well as myself, but I also found myself in this really weird push and pull between being commercially successful and marketable to brands that I was working with, whilst also trying to not alienate my own community with some of the back-end messaging that was happening by being in these bodies of work. It was never just I got to show up in the campaign and that was it. I also had to talk about why it was important for trans people to be framed in these campaigns to begin with. And that took such a toll on my mental health. One I didn't really recognize until the pandemic. When everything started slowing down in 2020, obviously there was no work in terms of fashion modeling work. And so for the first time in what felt like years, I had to actually slow down and be alone with my thoughts. Boy, was I thinking. I didn't really consider what it would be like to be a singular person in an industry that was so hyper specific about presenting ideals and archetypes of people. But I didn't think about what toll that would take on my mental health. I didn't think about how much I was censoring myself and quieting aspects of my personality to make sure that every time I was showing up in front of camera and being present, it was the most idealistic and sanitized version of what trans femininity could look like in those ways.
Do you feel that trans people are represented, the women especially, trans women are represented? Because I remember, was it last year that there was that whole controversy with Mendicha as well? Mm-hmm. How do you feel, especially here?
I think across the board, like trans women, trans men, trans people aren't really represented in any real aspect or sector of South African culture.
Also, I started doing this when I was 18. I was figuring out who I was, like a lot of us are, and I didn't really give myself enough space to really tackle some of the aspects of my own identity I wanted to keep sacred. I think one of my biggest regrets is actually transitioning that publicly in that way. Now, I will say, I'm obviously not a famous person, but I think there's a big difference between fame and visibility. And I was a highly visible person.
I think that our industry can do a lot better though. So I'm like one of the only trans models working in South Africa at the moment. And I feel like I'm also coming from a position of privilege because I appeal to society's idea of femininity. And for me, it's about like breaking gender down completely and like getting people that aren't kind of appealing to someone's idea of what being feminine is or masculine is and kind of just reconstructing that holistically. It's really exciting though because I feel like that shift is coming. I just wish it was coming more than from one place.
A lot of people were seeing me without really attaching my identity to the images of myself. And I think that's a lot harder because when you're famous or well known, you still get to assert your identity through that lens. But when you're hyper visible, you're an object, a visage, a thought of an identity rather than a person in your entirety. And that's really difficult. I will say though, I'm super grateful that I was given access to the platforms and opportunities I got because I think I did a pretty good job at breaking down some of the barriers that existed. And now I see a lot of South African trans people in the spaces that we previously did not exist in. And I'm really grateful that I got to be one of the first people to do that for my community. I also think I did a pretty good job at accurately and honestly portraying some of the aspects of transness that people might not have considered for the first time. Being trans, especially in Africa, isn't easy. And there's a lot of hurdles that exist beyond just the social ones that people confront. Our medical system is a little bit flawed, and a lot of access to gender confirmation is singularly based on your other levels of access and privilege. I am incredibly privileged because my identity as a trans person in South Africa is not typical. If anything, I'm an outlier to the general experience that a lot of trans people have. And that's also what took a toll on me, is recognizing that I was only allotted access to these spaces because of the inherent privileges I had. And so the pressure of making sure I showed up not only for myself, but also for trans people who are a lot more marginalized than me in our local community, it really started to do a number on me mentally. With all of that being said, I do think it's super important that if you are a queer person with the courage and bravery to speak up and be visible, that you should do that. I think now more than ever is the time for us to be visible, be loud, be vocal, tell our stories, because there used to be a time where we didn't actually have the ability to do that, and now we do. And I think that's special. But I will also say, deeply consider how you want your stories to be told. I don't think that there's anything wrong with wanting certain aspects of your life to be more private than others. I think if I had done things differently, I would have waited a little bit longer to feel more comfortable in my own skin before diving into the opportunities that were being presented to me, because I ended up being harmed by those systems irrespective of the net positive it was giving our community. So what do I do now? Well, I've kind of stepped away from fashion for a bit, but now I'm trying to break down doors in other aspects of entertainment. I make music now, which is really fun and exciting and has presented me new challenges that I found pretty rewarding. I'll link some of my music stuff down below if you're interested at all. I think it's pretty good, but I'm also extremely biased. And I plan on showing up more in spaces that I was afraid to re-enter. I think now I've come to terms and grips with some of the trauma I've experienced at the hands of the fashion industry, and I'm going to make it my responsibility to show up more for my community, because while I was doing that, it actually was super beneficial to all of us. I actually think now more than ever, it's really important for us to be in community. Plus, my music project is pretty specific, so I don't get a lot of opportunities to actually tell my stories or talk about myself. And so that's what I'm hoping to do more here as well. If you're at all interested in that, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. This is my first video, so saying that out loud is pretty surreal to me, but it would mean the world to me if you stuck around. Plus, this is my commitment to do more of this. I think I was so afraid for the last couple of years to show up because of the aspects of that meant performing my identity. And now that I'm in a space where I don't really feel the need to do that as much, I'm really excited to show up more. So yeah, it would mean a lot if you became a part of that journey as well. Anyways, I'm Baby Caramelle, still a little traumatized, but it felt really good to get that off my chest. This is me signing out. Stay baby. Mwah.